Hi guys, Coach Fenz here from FTP Training. I'm down here with Damien Mason, co-founder of the Watts Factory and one of my head coaches in FTP Training, a super frother converting lots of young riders up into the higher echelons of sport in this country. So thanks for coming and joining us, mate.
No worries, mate. Good to be here.
Look, what I wanted to sort of chat about today is something which we've chatted about a few times now while we've been on the road with Avanti, or you've been at races looking after your athletes, and we know as coaches we chat with our athletes and we're constantly talking about tactics, race tactics, some of the worries that they have when they get into the bigger pelotons, and there are some really. There's just that same stuff that we talk about probably time and time again to someone coming into the sport, and they just make the same mistakes. So what I wanted to do is sort of break down some of the common mistakes that people make in sort of road race situations, especially when they're not used to they're just not used to being in a big bunch. They ride at a club level, generally handicaps, and they get sent off in their bunch and they're just doing through and off turns, and then they go to a big scratch race and it's very, very different. So what's the most common question you think you've been asked in this last year by some of your newer clients?
Definitely without a doubt, it's they go into a race, they've done all the training, they've done all the work, they're fit. I've just had a group of masters go to nationals. I've got some young blokes that have been doing NRS this year. They do all the work, their training is good, they're hitting the numbers, yet they're coming away with no results. And the first question I'll put back to them, if we hadn't already discussed it going in, what was the expectation? What did you actually want from the race? What result was what you were after, whether it's to get a podium or to finish top 20 or to top 10? And most of them don't have it. There is no expectation. They haven't really defined what it is they wanted from the race in the first place. So if that's not there, it's like having a training program with no race or target at the end of it. Well, what are we actually trying to do? So I'll walk them back. I say, it all comes back to, what was your race plan in the first place? What is it that you wanted to achieve today from this particular race? If you haven't gone through that process and you haven't thought about it, then how do you hope to achieve it at the end? The physical side of it is always where most people get caught up. They want to hit the numbers, they want to know their FTP is high enough, they want to know that they can stick with the bunch. Once they've actually achieved that, they haven't gone to the next step, and that is, well, now what am I going to do? How do I actually get a result? And what is that result? What is a realistic result in the first place?
So something I talk about a lot with my guys is, and again, I know full well that before each of those races, you would have gone through a lot of the scenarios that that we would generally see. I've talked about this before on Friday Tips with Fenz and in some of the mental skills. Is being instead of sometimes being result focused, is be process focused. So a lot of guys going to races, we can't determine who's going to be there, if people are going to be stronger than us. So therefore, going in with an expectation of a result can sometimes leave them feeling a little bit blue, because simply people were there that were better. So that thought of setting up the processes by which, even if they don't get an end result, they've nailed the processes, is often, I find, a really great way to just get those guys or girls getting something from that race, and then from that we can then sort of analyze how that went. Say, well, look, you did get your feeding and nutrition right, which is a big win. You didn't try and attack from the gun and try and spend all your time riding away from a bunch that was never going to happen and then get dropped. And you did get into the base of that big climb in a good position, so that you knew you weren't necessarily going to climb with the best, but you then got over the top. So, what in those sort of races, what would be your way of chatting to a client that's not really done a road race before and setting some of those sort of processes? What are the common things that people get wrong when they do turn up to their first scratch race?
Definitely, I'd sort of get them to focus on, if the result today is, or if what we're trying to get to is, even if they're just aiming for a bunch finish for argument's sake, I mean, I tend to go to the end and work back. So if I sort of know what I want to do, then I'll look at, well, what process, as you said, do I need to follow to get there? So if they're coming up to their first scratch race, it's a bit of an unknown as to the level of the field. They haven't bumped handlebars before. They're not quite sure of what's coming. If they haven't ridden at the front of that bunch before, they're not going to have the confidence to do that. So we'll start to go through some of the simpler things, bunch positioning within the peloton. So a lot of guys that just don't know what to do, they'll just ride on the back without really realising that can sometimes be the worst place to be because of the yo-yo effect of the bunch. If something does happen up the road, they're not going to see it, they're out of position. So it might just be for this first race, we're just going to work on your positioning within the bunch, which means, if you can find that you can ride midfield and you can ride really reasonably consistently, you can't really play a role at the front, but you're not quite there yet anyway, but I just don't want you sitting on the back. So from the minute they roll up to the start line, I say, right, don't just wander in at the back 20 seconds after everybody else. Line up nice and early, get yourself in a frontward position, but then be conscious of where you are in the group at all times. Don't just, we all know that washing machine effect of when you move yourself up and then 2 minutes later you're out the back door again.
So, sorry, I'll just quickly sort of talk about that because that's it is a common thing, and I know when, when you came up for your first NRS race when we were up at Toowoomba. Yeah. It can be very difficult if you don't really understand the ebb and flow of a road race. Your dominant teams will control, or your dominant riders will control that front few riders or front little controlled group, and everyone's fighting for their wheels. And if you move up on them, you're going to get a sledging, all right? And that's just the nature of it. And what tends to happen in the washing machine, of course, is it's just like a washing machine. When people move up on the outside, because there's no room for them to move through the middle, so they're either moving up on the outside in the wind or in the gutters, so they're using more energy, and then they get in behind the riders that they want to, and then they go right the way back, and they continue to do that process, and what tends to happen as well is that people try and move up at the wrong time in races, the hammer's down, everyone's struggling for wheels, and you're caught out of position, you're trying to move up. Well, the front of the race is going hammer and tongs at 50k an hour. You've got to go 60k an hour to get through to the front again. It isn't going to happen. You have to be mindful of that, knowing that road races, they surge and go. So you've got to be mindful that that's not the time to go, to be able to then sit on the wheels of the bunch you're with. You just roll through, working maybe in the convoy or what have you, knowing that front bunch will probably slow up, and then you can get back onto it. But that washing machine effect, it is a classic one, isn't it?
And you see it when it's been on the rivet, it's all strung out, and the guys are on the back, and they're just praying for this bunch to slow down. But when it does, they go, thank God for that, but they stay in the same position. Yep. Where the perfect opportunity is you can roll up 40, 50 places with no effort, slot yourself in at the gate, bang, you're up there, off you go again. But you see it time and time again, is they just so glad that the pace has gone off it, they just stay where they are. And you're just sitting there going, well, you just move, you've got to get up there, you've got to keep yourself up in a good position. And I went through it, every race it was like smacking my head against the wall, trying to work out what is the best way to do it. And what I actually found worked at the end for me was, for the first few races, I found that my brain didn't give myself a specific job to do just for myself. Yes, we had some team things that we wanted, but I just didn't really break down that process myself. If I just say to you, I want you to ride in the top 20, well, the next question I say is, well, how am I actually going to do that? And that relates to the size of the group, the pace, the wind, the course, left and right turns, KOMs. What am I physically going to do to achieve a top 20 riding position? And for those first few races, I just had it in my head I had to ride at the front. But then there was nothing else that I actually had in my head that told me how to do that. And it was only through several races that I started to ride in different places in the bunch, put myself in the wind, out of the wind, until eventually I came up with my own little system that started to work, that I could maintain that position. So then when I went into the next stage the next day, bang, I had 5 or 6 little processes in my head. The lineup, where I started, what I did in the neutral phase, made sure I used to always drift at the back initially, whereas I'm right on the wheels of the guys at the front. The hammer goes down, what side's the wind going to be? So I put myself in the right position for the wind. If it was a closed road or not would depend on how much road I had to play with, what side I wanted to be on, left, right, or in the middle. Typically found the middle was death because you couldn't move. So I tended to find that I could, as long as I'm on the right side of the wind, I could do what I needed to do on the outside when I needed to. And then be prepared to fight for that position. Once you do all the work to get there, then tell yourself, well, I'm not going any further back, and I don't care who comes over the top of me. So easy it would be for guys to just bump us off the wheel and we just slowly drift back. So it took me several races of those of getting hooped out the back to realise if I didn't have these specifics in my head going into each stage, then I wouldn't go through each step to get myself to where I needed to be. And even once I got to where I needed to be, I still had to then keep going through that process all the time to stay there. You don't want to necessarily be constantly trying to roll yourself up and burning yourself out all the time. But for guys that are new to it, there's no magical wand as to how to do it. You have to put yourself in that position. You have to be thinking about where you should be riding. How am I actually going to get there? And then once you're there, you constantly don't fall asleep, don't relax. Keep working on it. Keep thinking about where do I need to be, what's coming up. You might have your KOMs and your sprints or your hill climbs written down on your top tube so you know what's coming. If you've had a look at the course profile and the weather conditions, you know there might be some crosswinds coming up, and if the wind's coming from that side and you're caught out, then you know you're going to be exposed. You've already thought about all of that. You've already got that process written in. You're going to position yourself accordingly well before you even get there. The guys that just raced in Canberra just recently said to my boys, as soon as we exit the circuit, we had, about 9 Ks before they got to the base of Black Mountain. And then they had a sharp right-hand turn, they had about 400 metres, then bang, left-hand turn straight up the hill. So I said to my guys, from the minute you leave the circuit, you have got to be up the front. Now that process starts 2 laps to go, not when you exit the circuit.
That's right.
And the run, because everybody's already going 60 k an hour to that first turn. So if you've left the circuit and now you decide to move up, it's too late. So you had to be thinking about that when they were doing the internal circuits 2 or 3 laps beforehand, so that you moved yourself into the right position, so that when you exited onto the fast bit of road in the run into the turn, you were already where you needed to be. And you were simply concentrating on, right, I need to hold this wheel and do what I need to do.
So that really looks at planning. Planning's super important. We spend a lot of time in team meetings with Andrew Christie Johnson and the Avanti team. And it's a super drilled team. It's no surprise it's won the team NRS again, nearly won every race on the calendar. And it's no wonder it's the best team out there. The preparation and planning that goes in. Team meetings are like an hour long. Every facet of the race, every curve, every hill, there's contingencies and plans made. Exactly like Damo's just said, for where you want to be, where you do not want to be. I know that, another classic mistake, and another thing you can do going into these races, you've got to have a bit of mongrel about you, because it's a hard sport. And very quickly, as Damo said, if you lose your concentration, you're in 20th wheel, and you lose concentration, all of a sudden you're in 100th wheel. It's literally as quick as that. So you can't switch off. You've got to be fighting, you've got to hold that position, and sometimes that's going to be hard, sometimes you're going to be intimidated, but hold that position because it's going to be better for you in the long run. Look at the mocker or look at the course profile. If you're not the best climber, it doesn't mean you can't get over the climbs. But again, if you're going into that base of the climb at the back and you're not the best climber and that group accelerates, what are you going to do? You're just going to get dropped. If you've already thought that you're coming into a climb 4 or 5k before the pressure goes on into the base, and you've moved yourself right up near the front, it means when you start to go up the climb and the acceleration goes, you can just move your way through the peloton. You're still on, so hopefully when you go over the top, you're on the back of the group. You're not off the back of the group, which means you're still in the race. So, you know, if you've got a bit of a sprint about you and you're not the best climber, that's definitely the things you need to look for. And it really just comes down to that planning and being process driven, really, and having those processes. By nailing all them, we often see that the end results come, you know.
I mean, the most common comment I get is, I'll see how I go. Drives me mad when I hear that. You know, how are you going to go? Oh, we'll see what happens. Guaranteed no result, because when the time comes to do what needs to happen, whether it's Masters, you know, NRS, it doesn't matter. If you haven't already sat down, you know, I used to just role play in my head. I used to run all the scenarios. There's only so many scenarios in a bike race that are going to come out. You know, and there's not that many to think of. And I would role play them in my head of what I wanted to do, what I think that I could either create or participate in, so that when it actually transpired within the race, bang, scenario 2, go. And my reaction was already there. I was already riding in a position to suit what I thought might have been coming, or I was ready to either initiate. It's a thing that I never used to do in my first, you know, 5 or 6 Masters. You know, I come to you after every race, go, oh, I don't know what to, you know, every race. I'm out the back. I've spent the whole race on the front, wondering why every man's going up the road. Fenner hits me with, after working our ass off for 90 Ks, hits me with 2K to go. Yep, we won't talk about that. Move on. But that came down to because I hadn't thought ahead to what was coming, whereas this idiot thought about it before we even lined up. So I've done the work to get us there, thinking, yeah, we've done everything. It's, you know, there was 3 of us in the race, but I hadn't made the process of thinking, how am I going to finish this thing?
How are you going to win it?
How am I going to win the race?
That's what we used to talk about.
How do I win the race? I'd never even thought about it. All I was focused on doing was establishing the break, riding my ass off so that we ended up beating them by like 7 minutes or something stupid.
Yeah.
We could have sat up like 30 Ks ago and still wouldn't have got caught. But at no time in that race did I actually stop to think, how do I get a result? Never did it. And that was probably the race where I can actually look back and say that changed the way I used to race. Partly because I was dirty with this person, but I got over that. But the very next day in the crit, we'd had a chat. We said, well, this is what we're going to do. We actually went through scenarios and we went out and did it.
Yep, you went up the road.
Went up the road.
I soft tapped and let you go.
Let me go.
But never came across.
But it was the first race that I'd actually raced where I had an end game plan.
Yeah, no. And
I hadn't done it before. Yeah. And then every race after that, I've sat there and worked through the scenarios. They don't always work, and you obviously don't always get the result. But I always had a plan in my head, and by having that plan, I knew what I had to do within the race when certain scenarios would present, whether I let somebody go, whether I chased, whether I let somebody else chase. You know, if I knew that there was something coming and it's a full-on headwind and the guy's gone off on his own, good, leave him to it, etc. But I'd already role-played all of those in my head so that I had a plan. And then the race day was more about, right, I need to enact this plan today as best as I can.
So what I meant by soft tapping there was not that I let Damo go. It's that we had a race strategy. And again, I see this all the time, is that we raced as a team because we were against lots of riders there. So we raced as a team. I don't want to be chasing Damo down, having someone sat on my wheel, and then that guy's a faster sprinter than both of us and he wins the race. It serves no one any purpose. See it time and time again. You know, there'd be a group that gone up the road. This happens in Masters racing, and it's one of the reasons I actually just prefer the time trial, because Masters racing is invariably quite negative. It's invariably quite negative because people haven't necessarily always got a lot of knowledge about road racing. So a group goes up the road of 2 or 3 really strong riders, and then some guy who is really strong just gets on the front and drills it and tows everyone back up to the group. Okay, he hasn't even looked behind to see that he's got a whole peloton on his tail, who are all thinking, lovely, thanks for doing that for me, mate, that was fantastic, and they're back in the game. What he needed to do is think, well, that's the winning group. That's the winning group. I'm also one of the strongest here. I need to get to that group on my own. And how am I going to do that? So again, you know, I used to hit Damo left, right and centre. But the reality of it is that that's what you learn from, isn't it? They were the learning experiences. I've raced for years. And what I did is, you know, what you should do is you should then drift back to say 10th, 15th wheel. The group's gone up the road. You don't want it to go too far because then you've got to bridge a big gap. But you don't want to be so close that that everyone thinks they can make it. So you sit back to a group, you then hit it up the opposite gutter if you can, with no one on your wheel. You're hitting that front group of riders on the peloton with as much pace as possible so that they cannot get to you. If you've got one rider with you, that's okay, because then you can swap off together, get to that lead group, suddenly you're in the bike race. But you must keep your eyes open. Bike racing is all about a game of chess. And often the strongest rider does not win a road race, but the cleverest rider does. So looking behind you, looking where riders are. You know, if suddenly you find yourself in a position where the best riders have all dropped back and they're blocked, that's the time to hit it. You know, if someone's there and they've gone for their water bottle at the wrong opportune time, boof!
I can't think of anyone that's done that to me.
Boof! That's the time to make your winning move, because again, you're thinking, how do I get this? How do I win this race? How do I make this opportunity for myself? And you're thinking it all the time. You're not just going and riding, because then what happens? Someone else hits you, and you've lost it, or you haven't made that winning group. So I think from getting into racing for the starting, when you start, and getting those process-driven goals to hold the front. Not be aggressive, but, you know, not take people's, you know, aggression towards you and move to the back. And then being very aware of what's going on around you. Get those things right. The fitness will come, because we'll make sure that happens. And then you start to then piece the pieces together. Right, now, how can I win this? Or how can I get in the break? Then once you're in the breaks regularly, then start to consider, I'm in a position where I can win these races. How do I go about doing it? I know for sure winning is a habit. And if you have it in your head that you can win, you'd be surprised what you can draw out. And you know, that confidence is a huge thing, isn't it?
I mean, I can look back at that weekend. It's from every race after that, my main goal for any race was not to finish in the bunch. Whereas the previous 5 or 6 years to that, I thought everything happened in the bunch. So I worked to keep the bunch together. I did it for years, nearly killed me. Because my mindset was one of isn't that how all races finish? But I couldn't sprint to save my life, so I don't know what I was actually racing for. But for years, that's how I used to race. That I just had it in my head that I had to keep everything together. Once I got rid of that and realised, well, the only way I'm finishing this race is either I'm out the front in the winning break or solo, or I'm out the back because I've tried to do it for the last 60 or 70 Ks. That completely changed the way I approached every single scratch race, and even handicaps. You know, you do your work within the handicap for however long it might be, but as soon as you realise that the catch is going to be made, the switch gets flipped.
How am I going to win it?
Yep. It's not about catching the front anymore. It's about how I'm going to catch. And even when you're riding the handicap, if you think there's a good chance of you getting up that day, and I used to do this all the time. I'd ride big turns, power through. I felt great at the start, not even thinking remotely that
What did your old mate do?
Fuck off. Can't swear on video. You know, because at the start you feel great, never actually stopping to think, well, what happens if we catch the front? I've got nothing left. I can't sprint. I can't go with a move. But 15 Ks before, somebody starts pulling not so many turns, or the turns aren't quite as hard, or just such and such has disappeared. And then the next thing you know, the catch gets made. Boom, they're down the outside. I can't cover it. I've just done 2 hours worth of work. So, and all of that stems back to, I just never stopped to think, well, how am I going to get a result today? When I have had results, it's because I've stopped making those mistakes. I've been in a position where I've been in a bake rolling turns, and I'm measuring my effort. I'm watching my wattage. I'm looking. People say you can't use power meters in a road race. That's rubbish. If you know how strong turns you can pull, if I'm pulling 400 watt turns and my threshold's 340 and I've been out there for 2.5, 3 hours, I'm not going to have the power at the end. I've got to bring that wattage back. I've got to pull slightly softer turns. I'm controlling my effort so that when the time comes that we are now racing for the win, I've got something left in the tank. But I've made that decision 180, 90, whatever Ks ago, so that if that scenario eventuates, I've got something left in the tank to actually do something with it. Something that I never used to do in the first 5 or 6 years as a beginner. Never even thought to do it, to be honest. Now when I get my new guys, especially my new masters that I'm seeing, they're coming into racing for the first time as 30, 35, 40-year-olds. They've never been in this situation before. I'm now telling them, right, this is what you're going to do. Don't do that. Approach it this way instead. And I'm trying to get in their heads to say, look, mindset, change the way you think. And use the races that don't matter. Your local clubbies, local handicaps, local scratch races. Go off the front, lap 1. What's going to happen? Give it a go. Do it at different times. Wait for somebody to go up the road. Right, I'm riding 10th wheel, bang, go with him. Don't ever work for the bunch. Don't ever contribute. Always be thinking about how do I get out of this bunch. Then once I'm out of it, right, I've got somebody to work with. Are they rolling good turns? Yes, no. How far have we got to go? No, it's a block headwind. They're sitting on my wheel. Sit up, go back to the bunch, save your bickies, have another go later. The course might change, the wind might change. But always be prepared to chop, to change your mindset but always thinking, how am I getting this result today, whatever that result is going to be. I was just too locked into there's only one way to win a race, having now realised that was probably the one way you could never win a race.
Not a great sprinter, Damo, no. So look, guys, as you can see, lots of things to think about in road racing. It's a great game of chess out there on the road. Think about your racing. Think about some of the things we've talked about today, some of the techniques, some of the processes that you can use during the road race to get you further and further up the field, so that you are battling it out for wins, that you are battling it out for podium finishes, or you're just looking for personal bests, in terms of power outputs. There's some other goals that you can have in terms of hitting peaks in races as well, that if you're not gonna win, you can still take those as being big positives from that road race. So look, thanks very much, Damo. Very insightful. I'm sure there's lots of people have learnt lots of stuff there.
I'm just going to go out the back and bury those demons again.
Yep.
Come back to the surface.
Thanks very much, guys.